Welcome back, everyone. We're again here broadcasting from my apartment in Queens, New York, and continuing our daily coverage Monday through Friday on this coronavirus, the CCP virus. And we're going to do a shorter news update today, and then we're going to do an interview. We're going to have Curtis Ellis with us today. He's a top Trump economic advisor. He's going to talk about the feasibility about these lawsuits against the Chinese Communist Party, his views on why we need these investigations into the origin of the virus. He's also going to talk about the need for a boycott of Chinese goods. Before we jump into that, folks, if you haven't already, please remember to like and subscribe. Again, we need your support. Also, if you're on YouTube, click the notification bell. You get alerts when new videos are up. And also, I need to issue 2 corrections, and I apologize for that. First off, some of you pointed out that I said Chechnya in a recent broadcast, or I meant to say Czech Republic. And here's the context of that. Now, I mentioned that the Czech Republic was accepting Taiwanese coronavirus medical aid, but I said Chechnya instead of Czech Republic, and so again, apologize for that. And also in the previous episode, I mentioned that Marcus Aurelius, of course, wrote his book Meditations, former Roman emperor, lived during a famine. I meant to say a pandemic, very much like the one we're in now. In fact, he wrote his book Meditations during that pandemic. First, we're going to do a quick news update, and today we're going to be focusing on Trump ordering these meat processing plants to stay open and why that is something, the deeper context of why he's doing this, because of course he's being accused of putting these frontline workers at risk. Bloomberg News is reporting that, quote, Trump orders meat plants to stay open and move slammed by union. And of course the context of this is that Smithfield Foods and Tyson Foods were closing down their meat production facilities because workers are falling ill from this virus. Of course, the broader context of this as well is that there were reports saying within 2 weeks the United States might have a shortage of meat. But here's what Bloomberg News is reporting. It says Trump invoked the Defense Production Act. He said, quote, such closures threaten the continued functioning of the national meat and poultry supply chain, undermining critical infrastructure during the national emergency. Now, the government will be providing additional protective gear and additional guidance to the employees at these facilities, and the unions, of course, of these different meat production facility workers, are of course slamming Trump for this, saying that he's putting their workers at risk. Now, first of all, it's important to note that it's the unions who are angry about this, which, sometimes represent what the workers actually believe and sometimes do not. And oftentimes unions have political interests. Sometimes they're not just acting for local political interest, but even international political interest. And when you're dealing with Smithfield Foods, for example, Smithfield Foods was bought up by the Chinese regime. It was in fact the largest business transfer from a U.S. company, or from the United States to China, that had ever happened. And notably, Tyson Foods was of course permitted to process chickens for China. So both of these companies have very close ties to the Chinese regime. It's a question of whether the workers themselves want to continue working. Of course they have freedom to quit, they have freedom to move on, they have freedom to collect unemployment, and very likely they continue working afterwards. But again, the broader context of this was that the United States was risking a meat shortage within 2 weeks. The United Nations World Food Program issued a global food crisis report, warning of a, quote, hunger pandemic. And so there was warnings of a global food crisis, a hunger pandemic, as the United Nations put it. This is from David Beasley, UN World Food Program Executive Director. He said, quote, in a worst-case scenario, we could be looking at famine in about 36 countries. And in fact, in 10 of these countries, we already have more than 1 million people per country who are on the verge of starvation. In many places, this human suffering is the heavy price of conflict. And the BBC reported that Beasley told the UN Security Council, quote, we could be facing multiple famines of biblical proportions within a few short months. The truth is, we do not have time on our side. While the United Nations is warning of a looming food crisis, of biblical proportion famines, these meat production facilities are closing in the United States because of fears for their employees. And of course, Trump signed the executive order in response to that, notably that reports were saying within 2 weeks we could be facing meat shortages. Now, Epoch Times had a great story on this. The Chinese Communist Party's National Development and Reform Commission issued an emergency notice about a pending famine. Now, China is notably facing a food crisis from several directions. They're facing the issue that, of course, several years ago they relinquished their policy for grain self-sufficiency. They do not produce enough grain locally to feed their markets. In addition to this, they have the swine flu, they have the avian flu, and so their poultry, their pork products are being wiped out because of this. And so what this means is that China needs food imports to really stay afloat. And of course, there have been reports in China that they may be facing a food crisis there as well, because a lot of countries that once shipped food to China are currently not shipping that food because they want to take care of their local populations first. In addition to this, they're also facing locusts, and they're also facing factory shutdowns. Now, the Epoch Times reported, quote, in early March of this year, the Chinese Communist Party issued an emergency notice saying that the locust disaster might attack Tibet, Yunnan, and Xinjiang in mainland China through 3 routes in June and July. So in other words, by June and July, the Chinese regime was anticipating locusts to impact different parts of China. And of course, different countries are already dealing with this crisis of locusts wiping out their food supplies. Now, the Epoch Times also reports, quote, on April 26, 11 departments such as the National Development and Reform Commission of the Communist Party of China, the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs, and the Grain and Material Reserve Bureau jointly issued the, quote, notice on the serious implementation of the governor's responsibility system for food security in 2020. And it says they were requesting provincial, autonomous region, and municipal governments to implement from 5 aspects to guarantee, quote, national food security. The Chinese regime saw this as such a big issue that they had multiple departments, 11 different departments, focused on the issue of food security. And now, of course, they're not only dealing with these locusts, the coming locusts in June and July, but also, again, disrupted international supply chains and disrupted factories. And so, again, it is within this broader context, the United Nations warning of a food pandemic, right? Warning of a global famine, of China rounding up 11 different government departments, warning about a coming famine, and in the United States, meat plants closing, and also word that within 2 weeks we could be facing a shortage of meat. Now, with that said, I had the pleasure of speaking with Curtis Ellis this morning, and we'll be showing that interview now. Curtis Ellis is an economic expert and policy director with America First Policies, and he was also a senior policy advisor with the Donald J. Trump presidential campaign in 2016. And again, we're going to be talking about how feasible these global lawsuits are against the Chinese Communist Party, why an investigation into China and the regime's handling of the virus is needed, and he's also going to talk about his own opinions on why we need a boycott of China. All right, so Mr. Ellis, can you tell us a bit about these lawsuits? We know that Germany just went and just sent China a bill. I think it was 130 billion euros. The United States, we have a few class action lawsuits, one of them, for example, in Missouri. First off, can these lawsuits actually go through? Can this actually work? And, can these organizations file them as opposed to governments? It seems in some places it's the governments doing it, in some places it's just law firms doing it.
For the most part, governments have sovereign immunity, something called sovereign immunity. So it's very difficult to sue a government and collect from them. I don't see how anybody is going to get China to pay up on one of these suits. President Trump said he's going to get China to pay for damages related to the coronavirus. And there are many ways that can be done. So far as taking it through the courts, that's problematic. Now, I know that Senator Josh Hawley and others in the U.S. Senate have called for removing sovereign immunity from China so that lawsuits can go forward, so that individual Americans or individual businesses would be able to sue China for damages and try to collect money. Well, you can go ahead and sue, but good luck with trying to collect. The Chinese Communist Party feels it has the right to lie, cheat, and steal, and I don't think they're going to be really very concerned if somebody serves papers on them. An American serves papers on them and says, you're being sued and now pay up. It's not like collecting from your ex-husband or ex-wife. Other avenue that's been floated is for the United States to not pay the debt. China owns a lot of treasury bonds and a lot of debt, and some have suggested that we just not pay that. I think there's a problem there as well, because then you start to chip away at the underpinnings of the entire global economy and question the solidity and the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. This could have a domino effect, and soon others will be asking, well, I'm not going to buy U.S. Treasury bonds because maybe they'll take a disliking to something I do in the future, or they'll decide that I'm not worthy of repayment. And this could really end up slapping us in the face more than China. So there are plenty of other ways to get China to pay the damages. Certainly the most obvious one would be to remove Western capital from China. The Chinese Communist Party is being propped up by a constant flow, a constant infusion of Western capital, whether it's through the alphabet soup of international organizations that China has taken control of, or whether it's through direct foreign direct investment in China. And now we see that Germany is moving forward with plans to have Huawei build its 5G internet network. This is a direct infusion of Western money into the coffers of the Chinese Communist Party. Why would you give them money with one hand and then sue them and ask them to give you money back on the other hand? This is totally counterproductive. It's mind-bogglingly stupid, if I can be so blunt. So you look at as far as the lawsuits go, look back at history. People tried to sue Gaddafi, Muammar Gaddafi, the dictator of Libya, the ex-dictator of Libya. After the bombing of Pan Am 103, it was determined and established that the Libyan government had a hand in the terrorist bombing of the Pan Am flight over Scotland, over Lockerbie, Scotland, that killed everybody on board when it blew up at 30,000 feet. The people on board, the families of the victims, tried suing Libya, and they, of course, they won their suit, but they never got payment, or it was years and years before they got any recognition of their claims. So suing governments, suing foreign governments is very difficult. In normal circumstances, you would be suing China in a Chinese court. Oh, good luck with that.
Yeah, we can imagine how that would go.
Yeah, I recommend the U.S. government cut off funding to China in all of its myriad ways. And there are many, many ways that we are doing that. At this moment, as I said, funding an alphabet soup of international organizations, the WHO, the WTO, the World Bank. China is drawing billions from the World Bank on this 5-year contract that continues to extend loans to China and grants to China as a developing country. This is the second largest economy in the world. It's not a developing country. It's not the Central African Republic or Mauritania or the Congo. It's ludicrous. It's a sham to pretend that it deserves developing country status. And the fact that it has developing country status in the World Trade Organization, the WTO, means it's allowed to impose tariffs and do all kinds of protectionist measures that countries like the United States and the European Union members are not allowed to do. Again, this is a sham. It's a way for China to continue extracting money from the West.
Now, another idea, one that's been floated, is the fact that the Chinese Communist Party, of course, has some degree of state ownership over a lot of big businesses. And of course, they have a lot of money in the U.S. and in other countries. Could these assets be seized, just like, assets in any lawsuit? Is that possible? What are your thoughts on that?
I think a more fruitful approach than suing China would be to seize the assets of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese Communist Party government in the United States. Many of its so-called business enterprises are actually government-owned, government-controlled. So if we have a beef with the Chinese government, we can seize some of these assets. And you'll find that many party officials, many high-ranking members of the Chinese Communist Party, and the leaders of their state-owned enterprises own property in the United States. Some of these companies own property in the United States, starting with the Waldorf Astoria, for example. We could seize those assets. And we also should deregister Chinese securities listed in the United States. Again, this is another source of funding for the Chinese Communist Party. Chinese companies listed on American stock exchanges, such as Alibaba, whose owner, or at least erstwhile, or at least a one-time owner or figure there.
And until very recently, yeah.
A high-ranking member of the Chinese Communist Party. There is no distinction between the party and the business enterprises and the government of the People's Republic of China. There is no distinction. So if you have a beef with one, you can go after any of its tentacles, and it will have the same effect. And I would not underestimate the power of the boycott. The American consumers have a choice in many cases, not all, as to whether to buy goods made in China or not. If the goal is to starve the Chinese Communist Party and its proxies of money, of US dollars, we can exercise some of that through our wallets. Now, there are certain things which we have no choice. We are entirely dependent on China. When you buy antibiotics or you buy some medicine, it has some ingredients in it that are made in China. You have to take your medicine. But there are other instances, some discretionary purchases, where I would recommend everybody look at the label. And if it says made in China, there could be an alternative. Get a shirt that's made in Vietnam or Korea or Bangladesh or someplace else. If there is a choice, exercise that choice. Because the simple matter is, the Chinese Communist Party were cut off of funding, or even had its funding reduced, its supply of Western dollars reduced by just a few percentage points. That would be enough to destabilize the economy in China and to destabilize the regime, because the entire regime in China is based on this bargain it's made with the Chinese people. You will let us oppress you because we will give you a job. We will give you an increased standard of living, and your children will have a better job or a higher paying job than you did when you were a child. And that's the deal. If that covenant, if that deal falls apart because Americans aren't, and other Western countries aren't supplying China, the Chinese Communist Party, with a flood of money, then the whole deal falls apart.
Now, one question one of our viewers had asked the other day was interesting, which is the Chinese Communist Party. I think we know that a lot of their economic numbers are fake. And of course, if you talk to Chinese business owners, they'll say the whole thing is basically a Ponzi scheme. That the Chinese regime basically, they just print tons and tons of money. They say whatever they want on the books. They give this money for foreign direct investment. They give it to other businesses as kind of like annual payments basically from the regime disguised as loans or whatever. And, can't the regime just print money and not tell people about it? Can't they just continue this whole Ponzi scheme? Now, what I said basically in response to that was I think they can do it to a degree. But when the whole world is watching, they need to show economic decline because everyone expects economic decline. If they were to show economic increase right now, no one would believe it, and I think investors would pull out. What's your take on this when it comes to, can't they just print money, basically, and just continue lying to the world?
Well, they can keep printing money and give it out to the Chinese people and use it for internal purposes. There is nothing to stop them from doing that. Their currency is not convertible, and that's their big problem. They can't use that currency to buy anything. If they need to, when they buy iron ore from Australia, when they buy oil from Iran, or if they buy technology from the United States, or if they buy assets such as the Waldorf Astoria or a satellite, they have to pay in dollars. Nobody will accept the yuan. So the money we send the Chinese Communist Party is funding their acquisition of crucial assets and technology in the West. It's that simple. You're absolutely right. It is a Ponzi scheme. They are using the money they get from us today to pay the bills they got yesterday, to show this dynamic economy that's growing. Now, it is Western investment in China that raised millions out of poverty in China. It's Western capital, Western investment, plus the hard work of the Chinese people that built the economic miracle of China. It's not the Chinese Communist Party. It's not the paper money they printed. There's a sea of debt over there as well. It's a Ponzi scheme involving real estate loans and bank loans and private loans off the books. But in a very real sense, for all the paper money they can print, which is endless, they still need Western dollars, hard currency, in order to go shopping on the world market.
When it comes to these international investigations, I think, these are kind of the other arm of these lawsuits, both of which will hold the Chinese regime accountable for its cover-up of this virus, for its actions that basically, kept the world in the dark about what to expect with it. And even right now, for example, not allowing U.S. scientists to go to China, not just the lab, but just in China in general, to try to get a better hold of what's happening. When it comes to these calls for international investigations, of course, U.S., U.K. are calling for them. Australia is now calling for them. What do you think this represents in your understanding? What is the real significance of having these kinds of investigations?
We need to find out how this virus originated. We need the biological samples of the virus in order to develop treatments and vaccines and gain an understanding to prevent a future outbreak of some future virus. Calling for an investigation does two things. Hopefully, we'll actually get an answer. I wouldn't hold my breath on that, to be quite honest. I think it's, in one sense, it's a bit like suing China in a Chinese court. Good luck with that. It tells you something that China does not allow researchers in. I should say that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't allow researchers in. What do they have to hide? Why is the Chinese Communist Party preventing researchers and doctors and public health experts from coming in to see what happened? It tells you that they're trying to hide something. I mean, no civilized country would turn down public health assistance to clear up an infection. We're not investigating. The investigations that are being called for are not putting Xi Jinping in the docket in the world court. We're saying we want to investigate the origins of this outbreak so we can better deal with any future outbreaks, right? Now, if this was indeed a bat virus that on its own jumped to a human or jumped to a pangolin and then jumped to a human, there should be no reason why the government of China wouldn't allow people to come in and nail this down so that people stop playing with bats in the future. So what is it they're afraid of? Everybody knows China even helped propagate the story that there's this weird animal market in Wuhan. We get it. We get it that people there eat different kinds of food. What would we find there that might lead to some type of international sanctions on China? You have to ask. I mean, that's pure speculation. We might find nothing. Why are they not letting us come in and see how this whole thing evolved?
Yeah, have you heard their new narrative now? Two different outlets, they're diplomatic outlets. They're now saying there's no such thing as these wet markets in China. Yeah, I was joking about it. I was like, you know what? I like this narrative. I think we should actually roll with this one. Because if it did not originate in these wet markets, if they don't have wet markets, then where did the virus come from? They've just delegitimized their entire early arguments.
I tell you, the propagandists, the CCP propagandists, need a little upschooling. They need to upgrade. They need some continual education to up their game a bit. It's getting to be ridiculous. I understand the people in China just laugh at the propaganda. They don't buy it. They know the government's lying to them all the time. But stunts like that don't help.
Anything else you'd like to say? Any points you want people to know that you think we missed? Or, just generally, what do you hope people take home from this?
I think it's time to say boycott China. People need to boycott China on the government level, on the institutional level, pension funds, Wall Street indexes, Wall Street investors, and consumers. We need to look at any other place to put our money. A consumer boycott would put pressure on those companies that are still manufacturing in China, that have not moved their supply chains away from China. So I say everybody go to getoutofchina.us and get your bumper sticker to put on your car that says boycott China for jobs, human rights, and peace. It's that simple. It really is. That's not the only thing to do, but we need to keep reminding people who's responsible for this. And to the degree that Westerners are giving China money, we are responsible.
Right. So, Curtis, where can people find your work?
You can find my work at the AmericaFirstPolicies.org, AmericaFirstPolicies.org website. They catalog all the things I write. I write for American Greatness website, and I write for WND, World Net Daily, WND.com.
Right. A real pleasure having you on. Thanks again.
Hey, thank you. Keep up the good work.
Yeah, you too. Thank you. That's it for today, folks. Again, if you haven't already, please remember to like and subscribe. Click the notification bell if you're on YouTube. You'll get alerts when our new videos are up. And again, unfortunately, if you have subscribed before, double check you're still subscribed, because we're getting some reports that people are getting unsubscribed without their knowing. And of course, folks, if you have questions for me, leave them in the comments section. Every Monday I'll be going over some of them on the show. And that said, please take care of yourselves, stay well. We'll see you next time.